Now, the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has reacted to the budget, saying it lifted the lid on 14 years of Tory economic failure.
Well, joining us now is Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury, James Murray. James, is it time for change now?
Hi, good morning. Well, I think, look, if you look at what happened in the budget yesterday, the truth is that nothing that the Chancellor said changes the fact that taxes are still on course to be their highest in 70 years, that people across Britain are still worse off, and that we've had 14 years of economic failure from the Conservatives. And that's why it is time for a change, and it's time for a general election.
James, welcome to the show. The job here is to not just do one thing, is to try and look at all sides. So just explain one thing to me, if you can, my friend, and thank you for joining us. The Tories blatantly stole one of your policies yesterday, which is cancelling the non-dom tax loophole. I've heard Labour talk about this for months. I've also been told that it maybe would generate £2 to £3 billion. You're the man that knows the figures. It would be a fair criticism of you to say, and I'm not saying this for the wrong reasons, I want people to understand, that you seem to say that most of what you're going to do and the costings for so much is going to come down to that, which is only 2 or 3 billion quid. So what I'd love to know from you is, how would you, yesterday, have stimulated the economy? Not what they've got wrong. What can we, all those floating voters who don't still believe that you are fiscally responsible, despite the approach and all that, what would Labour do differently? We need some meat on the bone, James. We really do.
Well, look, you're absolutely right that fiscal responsibility is at the heart of what we've been setting out and what we will set out going into the general election. Everything we promise, everything we put in our manifesto will be fully funded and fully costed. And that's why we've set out specific tax loopholes that we wanted to close, to have an immediate injection in cash, to make an immediate difference to the NHS and so on. But in the long run, the real way to get public services on a sustainable footing, to make sure they have proper funding and, crucially, to make sure people across Britain are better off, is to get the economy growing. And actually, one of the big things missing from yesterday's budget was a plan for growth that will work. You know, there have been about 11 growth plans, I think, under the Conservatives. You know, none of them have worked. None of them have got the economy growing in the way that it should. And
James,
that's why we're putting growth front and centre of our policy.
You've criticised, I believe, 11 Tory policies for growth there, but what is Labour's plan for growth?
Yeah, so we want to invest in the transition to clean energy. We want to make sure that we're using the public sector to support private sector investment to get that transition to clean energy happening by 2030. We want to reform the planning system to help encourage growth. We want to make sure that we have a modern industrial strategy to make sure that the public and private sector are working together in all of the industries which are important in different parts of the country. We want to scrap and replace business rates to support our high streets to thrive. You know, there are so many aspects to our plan for growth, and I think what's really important is that we see this as being a way to have a government who is working with business to get the economy growing. Because in my job as Shadow Financial Secretary, I go and meet businesses all the time, and they all say to me, look, we've got lots of investment we want to make in the UK, we just need a government with a bit of stability, with a bit of certainty, a partner who we can work with in government. And that stability, that certainty would be an essential element of what we'd bring to government. So stability, get that private investment, reform the planning system and other parts of how our country works. That's how we get to growth.
James, I'm not like a dog with a bone. I absolutely accept that you have a job to do, and it's interesting because most of the people that we've talked to over the last few months will say the Tories have been so chaotic that actually Labour hasn't had to do much more. But yes, I'll give it to you. You're polished, all of you. You come out, you spin the message, and that's great. Let me ask you 3 specific things. Stamp duty. I suspect that everybody under 35 yesterday would have been devastated to know they made no difference to the stamp duty charges. So many people finding it incredibly difficult to get on that property ladder, and so many people being consumed by ridiculous rental rates and landlords who are unscrupulous. What will Labour do about stamp duty? Will he do something for people who want to get on the property ladder?
Well, I'm not going to make any promises about stamp duty without having a fully funded and fully costed policy. You know, that's not how we work. I'm not going to make things up on the hoof. But what I will say about housing is that we haven't built the homes that we need in this country for many years under the Conservatives. You know, what we need to do is get Britain building. And what I said in my answer to the last question about reforming the planning system is really crucial to unlocking that home building. The other part of housing for people across the country is about the private rented sector, because at the moment too many people are paying high rents for insecure, sometimes substandard accommodation. We need to make sure that we have a better balance of rights between tenants and landlords. The Conservatives have promised this for years but haven't put it into action. We would do that in a Labour government to make sure that private renters get a better deal too.
Just one other thing, very quickly. Another thing that people want to talk to us all about the whole time, pensioners. Will you guarantee that a Labour government will sustain the triple lock? Because there's 12 million votes, my friend, that all of you could do with.
Yeah, well, we'll set out our plans for pensioners in the manifesto in the normal way. But the truth is, this government has been chop and changing, putting a lot of concern and anxiety into pensioners' minds over their equivocation over the triple lock in recent years. So we want the Conservatives to keep the promise that they have in their manifesto, and we'll set out our plans in the manifesto going into the general election.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, you talk about house building, I agree. You talk about stamp duty and rents. You talk about pensioners. What about defence? What about defence? I mean, your leader has surprised me, to be fair. He's been straight out the blocks when he's talked about the Middle East. He's been quite different to what people have always assumed. And I'll use that word carefully about the Labour Party. And I think you've had, you know, in the last 4 years, what he's done is quite extraordinary to the Labour Party. It was only Corbyn 4 years ago, didn't want to do anything. So what would you say to the people who feel that yesterday's budget missed out on making this country stronger, that we should spend more on defence? Are you going to find money for that?
It is the first duty of any government to keep people in the country safe. National security is the number one thing that a government must make sure it looks after. And so that's why we've said on day one of the Labour government, we would launch a strategic defence and security review to establish the threats that we face and to make sure that the funding is there to protect us from them. You know, the truth is, in opposition, we don't have access to all of the intelligence material, and rightly so, that government ministers would have. But what we need to do is make sure that we are fully prepared against the threats that we face in the future. So that's why that review will start on day one. We'd make sure it's funded to protect us from those threats in the future, and that we can fulfil that number one job of government, which is to keep people in the country safe.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning, James Murray.
You're good, you are, James Murray. You are good. I'll give you that. Thank you very much indeed.